Under the gilded ceilings of the Imperial Palace, a life of silk and sunlight seems guaranteed, until the doors close and the rules begin to breathe down the neck like a second shadow. The Imperial Harem was not a dream of luxury, but a world with its own courts, its own economy, and its own quiet catastrophes, where a smile could be a strategy and a breath could be a verdict. Imagine waking to perfumed dawns and polished marble underfoot, yet knowing that one misstep could end a story before the next moon fades, because here, beauty was a currency, and the market never slept. The palace on the Bosphorus looked like a promise. Fountains murmuring in hidden courtyards, mosaic corridors radiating the cool of stone, and galleries that smelled faintly of cedar and incense, all bound within walls that kept in both secrets and music. Somewhere beyond those walls lay a city that pulsed with merchants' cries and ship bells, but within, the world narrowed to training halls, ritual, and the choreography of survival. Every corridor was watched, every gesture able to carry meaning, and every night a careful arithmetic of chance and permission. The women who entered did not walk the same path, though many began with the same fate: a marketplace, a transit across saltwater, a renaming, a re-education, and the slow reshaping of a life to suit an empire's taste. Teachers drilled posture, diction, song, embroidery, and the silent grammar of the room. How to step into a gaze and leave without a footprint, how to fill a pause without speaking a word. The goal was not only to please a ruler, but to endure the institution itself, which could be tender and merciless in the very same breath. Power was not only a throne, sometimes it wore a headscarf and held a ledger. In the quiet geometry of the harem, women learned accounts and alliances, favors and debts, and the timing that keeps a household from exploding into factions. A nod at the right moment could unlock a door, a wrong word could lock it forever, and few keys were forged twice. Choice was a ritual, dressed like ceremony. The night could unfold like a performance, attendants arranging fabrics like signals, trays gleaming like invitations, perfumes rising like a prelude, and a selection made with the indifference of tradition. Afterwards came the inspection, the kind that weighed silence and softness like evidence, and the whisper network that followed the result from corridor to corridor. Every number that ever entered this system had a shadow, a count of women, a portion who would never see freedom again, a tally of seasons survived without incident, a roster of servants who remember too much. Ages were not simply years, they were thresholds, and crossing them could mean a change of rank or the thinning of hope. Time itself was a discipline, metered by lessons, by meal bells, by the soft click of doors at night, by the cadence of prayers that parsed the day into partitions. Titles mattered like oaths. A woman who rose to become the mother of a prince stepped into a second name and a new gravity, and with it came a council of rivals who smiled like friends. There was always someone counting steps behind her, measuring the distance between praise and exile, and it was never a long walk. Some stories traveled on the breath of servants: the sovereign who favored a warm sherbet before sleep, the consort whose laughter cooled tempers, the chamber whose lantern was never truly dark. Other tales moved like warnings, silken cords kept for private reckonings, a ceremony that required no audience, a punishment that left no stain on marble, but would echo for seasons. The palace had many rooms and more silences, and both were used with precision. The palace also had a memory, and its memory preferred order. Ledgers recorded stipends and gifts, linens and spiced oils, musicians on retainer, scribes who inked blessings into margins, and overseers who approved each expense as if spending breath from a shared lung. To keep this great instrument tuned, the court relied on strict paths and practiced hands, with eunuchs holding those paths like threads through a loom. The eunuchs were more than guards. They were interpreters of mood and ritual, master schedulers, and keepers of keys who made sure the palace was a machine that did not grind its own gears. They learned faces like scriptures and moved through rooms like smoke, rarely noticed until notice was required. When tensions rose, they were the ones who cooled the room or made it hotter by a single, strategic pause. Not every woman arrived by theft or war. Some were offered by families seeking fortune, believing that proximity to the sun might save them from winter. The truth was more complicated. The palace could lift and crush with the same steady hand, and the terms of ascent were written in a script that changed line by line. A promise whispered in one wing could be unmade in another, and what looked like grace could become a test by dawn. Language itself was an arena. Women learned the sovereign's idiom, the humor of scholars, the indirectness of diplomats, and the art of saying everything with the way a cup was held or a curtain was drawn. They learned to hear the difference between a command and a suggestion, and to know which one was more dangerous. There was tenderness, too, in the spaces the rules forgot to light. Friends braided each other's hair and traded lullabies from lands they might never see again. They stitched small birds into the hems of robes and pretended those birds knew a way out. In the quiet after evening prayers, someone might hum a melody from a childhood market, and for a few breaths the palace loosened its grip. But the palace always remembered what it was, and it became clearest when succession entered the room like a storm in expensive shoes. A pregnancy could turn allies into students of the knife, a birth could reassign entire corridors, and a cradle could tilt the map of the household like a chessboard in strong hands. In that tilt, rooms shifted, stipends swelled or shrank, and smiles changed shape. The sovereign's attention was a tide, and tides come with mathematics. Nights were not simply nights. They were investments of favor and future, and those who tracked them could predict changes in weather before the lanterns were lit. A woman could spend a year treading water and still drown in a single evening's silence. Another could rise because her calm made a room breathe better. Beyond the palace, preachers and poets argued about virtue, duty, and the place of women. But inside the palace, the argument was practical. Who gets to speak? Who must listen? And who pays the price when a story fails to convince the room? The harem was not a monolith. It was a parliament of thresholds, chairing its own sessions in silk. It did not need public laws. It had habits, and habits can be harder to overturn than decrees. Every decree that did arrive, parchment under a seal, a neat line of ink that shifted a boundary, landed first as a rumor in the baths, then as a calculation in the accounts, and finally as a new rhythm in the halls. Administrators would nod, tutors would adjust a lesson, musicians would retune their instruments, and the women would watch which candles burned longer that night. Change came in increments, always with witnesses, always with a cost. The outside world imagined the harem as a chamber of velvet and idleness, but idleness is a luxury no one can afford in a place where attention is the only stable coin. The work was constant, presentation, refinement, remembering names and preferences, measuring rooms from their center of gravity rather than their corners. Those who survived longest learned to keep moving without appearing to move at all. Some figures rose from this world and bent the palace toward them with intelligence and timing, changing more by conversation than by decree. They learned when to approach the sovereign with a soft suggestion and when to disappear so an idea looked self-born by morning. Their victories rarely had trumpets. They were measured by which doors stayed open and which rivals stopped smiling. In this place, a gift was never only a gift. A bolt of silk could mark allegiance, a pair of earrings could signal a debt, a bowl of fruit could warn of company expected or company unwelcome. Gesture by gesture, the palace wrote itself in a language of objects, and fluency was not optional. And yet the simplest things endured. The taste of cold water before dawn, the comfort of linen warmed by a brazier, the way jasmine lifts in the courtyard after a brief rain, and turns the air into something a person might almost call mercy. Each small mercy helped the women count their days not by fear alone, but by pockets of beauty no rule could confiscate. In a house that taught everyone to calculate, beauty remained gloriously uncounted. Wind moved through the cypress, like a careful hand turning pages, and the palace listened, as if even the trees reported to someone with a seal and a title. In that listening, routines hardened into ceremony, morning prayers in a hush of saffron light, lessons under the gaze of tutors who measured progress in poise and restraint, and afternoons scented with rosewater where laughter could double as rehearsal for diplomacy. The day was a corridor with many doors, and behind each a different version of safety waited with its shoes neatly aligned. Training was a craft that polished without erasing, at least when it was kind. A girl learned to fold a letter so it did not need a wax seal, to take tea at a pace that made a conversation last exactly as long as it should, to let a silence gather like a net, and then lift it without showing effort. She learned music that did not beg for applause, languages that smiled from behind their consonants, and the arithmetic of gifts that spend twice, once when given, once when remembered. There were seasons when the palace softened. Spring filled the courtyards with jasmine and the suggestion that fortune might also bloom if tended well. Autumn brought figs and a maturity that suited careful plans. Winter pressed everyone closer to the braziers, where stories were told with the economy of people who knew that even talking has a budget in a serious house. For some, assent began with a coincidence that was not quite an accident. A phrase overheard, a question answered without trembling, a melody that stilled a restless room. Attention, once earned, needed steady tending. A single evening could set a career's temperature for a season, and a season could determine who had a chair when the music stopped. Influence arrived softly, like steam, and hardened into shape only when the room cooled. Between the women moved currents that did not announce themselves. Friendships grew in the shade of shared tasks and were tested in the bright light of opportunity. Loyalties were real but not naive, and kindness traveled best when it did not carry a receipt. A borrowed ribbon could start a habit of trust. An unreturned book could put a hairline crack in a bridge that would be needed later. Over all this hovered the architecture of the state, translated into linen, silver, and schedules. Stipends reflected favor. Permissions mapped a quiet geography of who could pass and who must wait. Festivals offered public theater where private meanings were exchanged beneath layers of scripted joy. The palace kept 2 ledgers at once, one inked in neat columns and one written in glances. Eunuchs threaded both ledgers together, adjusting the weave so nothing tore under strain. They were archivists of mood, walking calendars who knew the anniversaries people would never say out loud, and choreographers who could keep rivals an arm's length apart in a hallway that was technically wide enough for 3. Their neutrality was not indifference. It was a discipline that preserved the instrument so it could continue to play. When a sovereign favored a consort, the air changed color for a while. Lanterns seemed to burn steadier in her corridor. Musicians found themselves summoned to the same wing. Scribes were asked to prepare phrases that could pass for spontaneity when spoken in the right room. Then, as tides do, the water turned, and everyone watched to see which sandbars would appear and which boats would ground themselves in sudden shallows. A pregnancy was more than a private condition. It was a declaration written on the body, and declarations draw witnesses. Old alliances shored up their beams. New proposals arrived wrapped like gifts, but tied with complicated string. Elders of the household judged without seeming to, and prayers multiplied in proportion to anxiety. Even the kitchen felt it. Sudden cravings became directives, and a cook's timing gained political weight. Birth redrew the map. Rooms were reassigned. Tutors recalculated their calendars. Rivalries recalibrated from a fight for the present to a negotiation with the future. A cradle did not just hold a child, it held the possibility that doors long closed might open on well-oiled hinges, and the possibility that other doors would never open again. Beyond these domestic storms, foreign envoys brought their own weather into the palace. They wrote home about velvet and ceremony and missed the parts that could not be staged, and yet, sometimes, they noticed the pressure points. The way a head of household paused before approving a request, the way a musician's repertoire shifted one afternoon toward melancholy. Outsiders often mistook grace for permissiveness and silence for consent. Inside, silence was a tool with many edges. A woman could use it to shield herself, to sharpen a thought, to make another person fill the space and reveal their hand prematurely. In a culture that prized eloquence, the most strategic sentence could be the one left unspoken until it was asked for by name. Not all endings were catastrophic. Some were simply the dignified settling of a life into a new orbit. A woman past the height of favor might become an expert gardener of talent in others, extending her reach by teaching and by placing protégés where they could flourish. Influence that leaves fingerprints is fragile. Influence that leaves traditions tends to last. Religion offered both refuge and mirror. In devotion, some found a steadier rhythm than court calendars could offer. In charity, others built networks that spoke a language politics could respect without claiming. Piety could be sincere and useful at once, and no one had the luxury of pretending those qualities were in conflict. On certain nights, music swelled from the inner gardens, and the palace remembered that it was also a house of art. Dancers traced histories in the air, poets traded metaphors like finely worked metal. An oud answered a nay, and for a few measured moments, even, ambition took its shoes off and sat down. Art did not cancel the harder truths, but it gave people a shape into which they could pour them without breaking. The city beyond the walls watched the palace like a moon, distant controlling tides, while never quite seeing its craters. Vendors guessed at rumors while weighing figs. Boatmen told tales that sounded true because they were well told. Preachers borrowed palace anecdotes to give their sermons teeth. Meanwhile, within, the real work remained, making a life out of limited materials and abundant scrutiny. Some names became legends, though legend is simply memory that has learned to sing. These women did not climb by accident. They read the room better than their rivals, chose their moments with a surgeon's restraint, and preserved their nerves when the air thinned. From them, the palace learned a lesson it pretended not to need, that governance and intimacy share a set of skills. In time, reforms drifted into the household like new rules for an old game, promising safety in some corners and extracting obedience in others. Edicts softened rituals that had cut too deeply, but no edict could erase the older habits in a single season. Habits keep their own archives. So the palace adjusted, as it always had, with compromises that made sense on paper and customs that made sense in practice. What never changed was the arithmetic of attention. A person who knew how to spend it, save it, and compound it could survive where others could only hope. A person who squandered it learned quickly that kindness cannot outrun physics. The palace rewarded endurance that looked like elegance and punished clumsiness even when the heart behind it was good. And still, beneath calculation, humanity found its seams and widened them. A lullaby spoken into a sleepy child's hair, a letter copied 3 times so at least one version would reach its reader. A small act of disobedience performed so gently it looked like grace. These were the gestures that made the place livable, the proofs that ritual does not own the soul unless invited. Night taught the palace different manners than day, and the lessons started with light. Lanterns filtered through fretwork, moon pooled in basins, the corridor candles trimmed so their smoke would not gossip about footsteps. Schedules shifted to a quieter octave, baths steaming like winter breath, music tuned to the key of restraint, and voices carrying only as far as they were meant to go. Here, privacy was curated, not granted, and that curation was an art the household practiced with unwavering finesse. Selection wore ceremony like a mask. Fabrics aligned by color and mood, a tray arrived with sweets and suggestion, perfumes lifted as if they had opinions. The room understood what was about to be decided long before anyone said a word, and yet every gesture had to be re-performed as if it had never been performed before. Afterward, the night acquired a second stillness, the fadi kind that listens for outcomes. Attendants worked with the delicacy of physicians and the discretion of archivists. They recorded nothing and remembered everything. Approval in this world rarely used a signature. It preferred the rhythm of routine, the renewal of permission, the absence of interference. The ledger of affection was never only personal. It underwrote scholarships, dowries, promotions, and the long maintenance of buildings that did not repair themselves. A favorite's success could fund an entire ecosystem of careers, just as a sudden fall from grace could set off an avalanche in accounts and appointments. The palace was a city dressed as a household, and its economics breathed in time with its emotions. Rivalry thrived where resources concentrated. The wise did not fight the river. They learned its bends and lived by its floods and droughts, building small dams of patience and sluice gates of humor. Open conflict was rare because it was expensive. Indirectness was not cowardice, but cost control. Whispers described punishments that left no stain and ceremonies that concluded without witnesses. And even if the details blurred, the message remained sharp. Boundaries were real, and someone held the rope. Fear alone cannot run a system, but fear braided with admiration and the promise of reward can tune an institution to concert pitch. The palace preferred that chord. Beyond inner politics lay the broader theater of empire. Caravans delivered fabrics with old names and new rumors. Captains brought news that tasted of brine and risk. Scholars drifted in with manuscripts that could start an argument or end one. The Harem was not isolated from this traffic. It was a filter and a weather vane, registering shifts before courtiers found language for them. Education expanded to fit the century. Calligraphy remained a discipline of the hand and heart, but arithmetic sharpened into accounting. Music kept its grace but learned to speak at diplomatic volume. Languages moved from courtesy to utility. A woman who could translate a visitor's subtext had a value the treasury could not easily calculate. Some reforms arrived with trumpets, and some arrived like dew. The loud ones redrew procedures, the quiet ones adjusted expectations, removed a cruel hinge from an old door, or insisted that a petition be heard before a decision put on its shoes. Kindness began to appear not as indulgence, but as policy, and policy, when it worked, felt like air rather than architecture. In this evolving grammar, mastery meant staying legible without becoming predictable. A woman learned to refresh her skills without advertising her reinvention, to keep her counsel until counsel would be a gift, to let a rival waste energy on the wrong question. The most difficult art was patience that never curdled into resignation. On festival nights, the palace staged a public version of itself, generous and luminous. Gifts traveled outward, bread and coin, textiles and spices, and gratitude traveled back in the form of songs that made the walls feel porous in the best way. For a moment, the household and the city agreed on the same story about themselves, and the agreement fed both. Then the lanterns dimmed, the gates drew their breath, and private life resumed its careful measures. In rooms where laughter had overflowed at dusk, only the rustle of garments remained. In corridors that had been orchestras of color, the night guard sandals wrote a thin music. The palace exhaled, not tired but vigilant, as if rest itself required supervision. At dawn, duty put on its daytime face, and the palace returned to the elegant mathematics of order. The morning bells divided the hours like careful cuts, each one assigning attention to prayer, to study, to the small administrations that keep grandeur from fraying at the edges. Even beauty needs maintenance. The harem understood this better than any place that believed itself permanent. Instruction remained the spine of the day, a steady climb with well-placed landings. Calligraphy deepened not only the line, but the breath. Music trained the ear to recognize when a room needed gentleness or a sharper tempo. Languages stacked like bridges toward visitors who thought their meanings were hidden. Needlework, sometimes dismissed as ornament, taught a discipline that could face any meeting without trembling. Beneath the curriculum ran a simpler lesson, the ethics of proximity. People living so near to power and to one another learn a choreography of consideration, a practice that spares dignity without wasting truth. It was this craft that allowed crowded lives to avoid collisions or to make them look like bows when they came. The economy of favors moved with a velocity the official accounts could not register. A place at a performance, a new ribbon for a young singer, a chance to read to a scholar. Each gesture accrued interest in a bank that had no roof and no closing hour. Debts of kindness did not demand payment, but they did keep excellent records. When storms brewed, they brewed quietly. A request delayed 2 days longer than expected, a door that used to open on the first knock now requiring the second, a rumor that refused to admit its source. These were the barometers that mattered. In such weather, the skilled moved sideways rather than forward and reached the same destination with fewer footprints. Foreign news arrived like pollen, settling on everything and changing what would grow next. Wars elsewhere meant grain prices here. A treaty over a distant mountain range translated into a new tutor hired for a prince. A poem praised in another court resurfaced as a melody in the inner garden. The harem was not a sealed jar. It was a living organ that breathed the empire's air and filtered it with intelligence. Eunuchs coordinated these breaths with the discipline of stewards who know the cost of improvisation. Their calendars nested within other calendars, and their discretion allowed human flaws to pass through the system without becoming failures. A glance from the chief could loosen a knot that 5 letters could not untie. Among the women, mentorship made a second family that obeyed different laws. A seasoned favorite could teach a newcomer how not to hurry her luck, how to let attention find her by being ready for it every day, and how to store courage like coin for nights when the room ran cold. These teachings built a continuity that outlived fashion. There were inevitably reckonings. Not every rivalries could be managed by etiquette. Sometimes a corridor narrowed to a single choice, and sometimes a household remembered that it was also a court. When that happened, decisions came down like winter, clean, cold, and indifferent to the wishes of trees. Justice, such as it was, preferred solutions that preserved the furniture. A reassignment could feel like mercy or like exile, depending on the story told about it. A reduction in stipend said more than a speech. A door that no longer opened did not need to explain itself. The palace punished without spectacle when it could, and when it could not, it made the spectacle instructive. Amid all this, personal lives tried to be personal. People still wrote poems and hid them badly. They still kept small gardens in clay bowls on windowsills. They still learned to love in ways calibrated for survival. Affection in such a place becomes precise. It knows when to look away and when to be seen. Festival cycles stitched the year together, not just with feast and song, but with forgiveness made official enough to be safe. In those sanctioned hours, even grudges rested. Even the stricter elders let laughter run one gate farther than usual. The city watched and felt included, which was a form of governance the edicts alone could never achieve. By afternoon, the light lengthened, and with it, the patience for ceremony. Audiences grew more formal, music brushed the air like a well-bred breeze, and the day angled itself toward the decision points that would give the night its tone. The rhythm of attention, spend and save, resumed its ancient arithmetic. Evening gathered the palace into itself, drawing long threads of gold across stone as if to stitch the day closed without leaving a scar. Decisions made in the bright hours began to show their weight. Rooms cooled, lanterns steadied, and the household listened for the subtle click of consequences finding their hinges. This was when the harem revealed its truest craft, turning risk into ritual and ritual into a safe place to stand. Some nights were quiet victories measured in breaths rather than applause. A petition found its way to the correct desk. A rival accepted a boundary without needing to bleed on it. A lesson finally settled into muscle memory so it could serve without thought. In these small, exact triumphs, a life made under scrutiny learned how to be generous without becoming naive. There were also nights that asked for courage with no time to practice it. A messenger arrived too late with news that could not wait. A corridor turned into a question with only one honest answer. A friend needed a witness more than advice. When these moments came, the women who endured did so not by hardness, but by clarity, keeping their hearts unconfused, even when the room was not. The sovereign's orbit continued to set tides, favor rising, receding, returning in patterns that made sense only if one watched for seasons rather than days. A wise favorite learned to be present without being hungry, useful without being obvious, and indispensable without making anyone feel replaced. Influence that survives does so by leaving people stronger than it found them, and the palace remembered the hands that did that work. Reforms kept drifting in like new instructions on an old instrument, sanding a cruel edge here, adding a safeguard there, insisting that accountability dress itself as custom so it would be welcomed at the door. The household adjusted with the elegance of a dancer changing partners mid-song, keeping tempo while learning new steps in real time. Mercy, when structured, became a practice rather than an accident, and practice is how institutions forget their worst habits. By now, the city's myths and the palace's realities overlapped like two pieces of silk, translucent and persuasive in different light. Storytellers outside preferred velvet, fountains, and intrigue. Inside, the truest luxuries were sleep that arrived on time, bread still warm at dawn, and a day that ended without a bruise on anyone's dignity. Perhaps that is the secret most often missed. Survival here was not only a matter of caution, but of craft. Mentors aged into archives with legs carrying unwritten constitutions from room to room. They taught younger women how to choose silence that protects rather than punishes, how to accept a delayed reward without making bitterness a tenant, and how to walk away from a spectacle that wanted to eat them for dinner. Through them, the palace learned a slower courage, the kind that keeps the lamp trimmed on nights with no moon. Some futures closed, and others opened where no door had been drawn. A reassignment that felt like exile revealed itself as a sanctuary where a voice could grow. A disappointment saved someone from a triumph that would have been too heavy to carry. A quiet corridor turned into a thoroughfare because two people decided to treat it like one. Luck has many wardrobes, and in this house it often dressed as patience. In the end, what lasted were not the loud moments, but the practiced ones. Hands that knew how to pour tea without spilling attention. Voices that could say no in a way that left the room grateful. Eyes that noticed when fear needed a smaller task so it could stop pretending to be destiny. These were the tools polished daily until they looked like grace. Final nights came for everyone. Endings that were really transformations. A celebrated favorite became a patron who lifted others. A vigilant rival became a steadfast ally because someone offered respect that did not keep a receipt. An overlooked apprentice became the person everyone trusted when the lanterns flickered. The palace, for all its appetite for spectacle, still relied on the quiet competence that could be neither bribed nor threatened into existence. What then was the harem at its clearest focus? Not a fantasy, not a prison, though it could borrow the looks of both, but a school of poise under pressure, an economy of attention, and a parliament conducted in silk, where policy was measured in outcomes rather than slogans. It was a place that taught endurance without cruelty when it was at its best, and masked cruelty as tradition when it was at its worst. And everyone learned to tell the difference by touch. If there is a mercy to be claimed from such a house, it is this. People learned how to be kind on purpose, not by accident. They learned to hold power lightly enough that it did not bruise the hand, and to place it down carefully enough that it did not bruise the floor. And they learned finally that the most radical act in a room full of rules is to remain unmistakably human without asking permission first.